All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Blake Ericson. I'm with Montrose Environmental Group. I've been doing this for about 10 or so years now. So I started off as a field chemist, predominantly just running FTIR systems. So a little bit of a fun fact, every year I average about 3 trips around the globe due to travel with the job. So I've been to many states and lots of countries internationally doing this job. So it's been a lot of fun and very challenging. So here to talk to you today a little bit about FTIR, which we've all kind of touched on a little bit already, and how we can get better data, better quality, and know that what we're testing is accurate. So we won't go too far into the basics of FTIR since it's already been kind of talked about today, but for general purposes, what does FTIR stand for? And that's Fourier Transform Infrared. And I know that's a mouthful, but believe it or not, this is something that's been around since the 1700s. So it was a man named Fourier. He was a Frenchman, and he came up with the calculus behind this. So it's been around for a really long time. Now, we haven't had the instrumentation we do, right? But we have the math, and working on that, it's been around for a long, long time. So this is a tool we use in stack testing, but also in the SEMS world for compliance and engineering purposes. But it's a lot more involved than just stack testing and SEMS. We can use this in process gas monitoring, optimization. We can use it for CO2 purity in pipeline, greenhouse gas emissions, siloxanes, right? There's a whole slew of things that this thing can do as long as it's done well. So before diving into the nitty-gritty of FTIR, I always like to talk about this slide a little bit on the reality of emissions testing. And this guy here, you can see he's pretty small, especially if you're in the back of the room, but he's hauling up a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket, and there's probably some ice, some other things in there. And he's about 200 or so foot up in the air. So you see all these, the monorails, there's pumps, there's all these things that weigh anywhere from 1 to 25 pounds, sometimes 50 pounds. We've got to pull all that stuff up there, right? We got to set up the trains and all that, all in order to get really, really small concentration data for you, the end user. So stack testing is a very challenging field. It's mentally demanding, it's physically challenging, and you're working in all weather conditions all year round. And this is why collecting data of higher quality for SEMS and compliance is so important, because of the challenging environments. So what we like to say in stack testing, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but stack testing is the only industry that I know of where you actually start at the top and you work your way down. That's how you climb the ladder of success in stack testing. Although being at the ground level, running the trailers and all that glorious either. So as I mentioned, field testing is tough. A lot of the benchtop studies are done in-house, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, when you're out there in the field, you're in a trailer, you're in challenging environments, it's a lot harder to collect good data. So as mentioned, you're only as good as your equipment, right? You could be the best FTIR spectroscopist in the world, the best chemist. It doesn't really matter, because if your equipment sucks, your data is going to be wrong. So that's why having good equipment, good technologies, good people really, really matters. And as a customer and regulatory person, right, the one thing I want you to leave here today is, if you've heard of FTIR, you might have heard some negativities, some cons with the systems, but don't fret the black box, right? I've heard it called the voodoo box, the magic number generator, and that's not at all what this thing is. When it's used by a well-trained person, a chemist, it's an amazing, amazing tool. So as mentioned, we need good equipment. We also need good instrumentation. And for just simplicity purposes, how the FTIR works is by essentially taking photographs of spectra, right? And we need a good signal. We need good signal to noise ratios, all that stuff. And we're taking pictures of the spectra, doing a little bit of mathematics, Fourier transform, and we're getting this wide array of spectra, right? And we can quantify hundreds, if not thousands, of compounds. It's not a perfect instrument, right? There's certain things that work better than others. But FTIR is really darn good for most combustion-based compounds, especially in the turbine world, gas world. It works really, really nicely, and it's real time. So rather than you taking samples, sending it to a lab, you get results on site. So you kind of know if you pass or fail. Go ahead.
What's really good about it is safe spectrum can be reanalyzed.
Exactly.
That's the cool thing.
And we'll talk about that. So that's what he is saying is we can always go back, right? And we can add, subtract. The way that we validate spectra to make sure it's right is we do subtractions. And I'll talk about it a little bit. With other instrumentation, nothing against it, but you're collecting the data on site, right? You're sending your cal gases, making sure things are good, but it's being pumped into an Excel sheet, right? Once you have the Excel sheet, there's no way to go back. So that's the argument of why, I'm biased, right? That's why I like the FTIR, because you can always go back and make sure that the data is correct. So speaking of that, why improve the reliability of test results? Well, there's just a lot of variability in the things that we do. And the test results might not actually represent your actual emissions, right? If you're using an emission factor that's really old, or if you're getting an instrument that doesn't get as good of a detection limit as needed, right? You might be able to be a Title V source, use the really low concentration data and become an area source, right? That's going to save you a lot of money, a lot of headaches. Numbers below detection, right? Is it a real number? You don't know. On the contrary, if your numbers are higher, right, it's also bad because you're going to face NOVs, which are fines from the EPA. You're going to get public scrutiny. People are going to be pointing the finger at you. You don't want that. And furthermore, once you fix everything, which is expensive, you got to go out and retest. So the landscape is changing, right? Us as stack testers, especially over the past 4 years, we all know there's been incredible change in our industry. And we were absolutely subject to everything that's been going on. The EPA has been hammering the industry hard the past 3 years. All these ICRs, which are information collection requests, more stringent testing, and detection limits that are getting lower and lower, right? We're seeing some compounds where the EPA is expecting, formaldehyde, for instance, in quad Y, 90 ppb or less. And some states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, California, they want those detection limits even lower. And the good thing is that the FTIRs that we come up with, there's a lot of configurations, but we can get that low. So the data, as I said, needs to be precise and accurate, just for everyone's sanity. So taking all these points together, right, from a SEMS perspective, from a testing perspective, it's going to impact your data greatly. Whether you have a cold spot, you're missing flow, there's wrong equipment being used, it's going to really impact certain analytes more than others. You're not going to probably see, if you have a cold spot, an impact on NOx, CO, some general combustion that aren't water soluble. But if you're looking at ammonia, HCl, formaldehyde, ethylene oxide, you name it, these little mistakes add up. And once again, your data is going to be incorrect. So this is going to be hard to see, especially for you in the back. Yellow and black doesn't really blend too well on a PowerPoint. But up here we have ammonia and water, and then here is NO and CO, and this is on a startup of a turbine. And what they had was an FTIR SEMS, and they wanted us to come out and say, they were like, something's wrong, doesn't make any sense. NOx, CO is flat, ammonia's all over the board, what's going on? And really, the second we looked at this, it's a very simple case of cold spot. And the reason I say that, and one of the questions is, how can I tell if a cold spot exists in my system? The nice thing with your analyzers, or in this case, the FTIR, if you're looking at moisture, this is a clear indicator. You see these spikes? They kind of go with the ammonia really, really closely, right? Because that ammonia is scrubbed into that water. And as the pump's pulling, we see this flux. Now this is the startup, remember. So NO, you got this big flat plateau. CO, you got another plateau here, and it drops down to nothing. So if you're just looking at your NOx and CO, you're like, okay, I'm good. But in the bigger picture of things, you got an issue with your system. So now diving into QA/QC, quality assurance, quality control. In FTIR world, we generally follow EUEC method 320. Thousands and thousands of tests done with it. We also follow ASTM 6348-12, and there's a revision coming out to that soon. But we have to do certain things to make sure that the system's working right as a tester, right? We have to send direct gases to the analyzer through the system. We have to do an analyte spike. Pretty stringent stuff to make sure things are well. But as a validator, right, we validate a lot of external data from companies that are doing FTIR testing. There's a lot of things that we see that we kind of want to eliminate from the industry. And one of the big ones in spiking, it's one of the hardest pieces of QA/QC to pass in FTIR world, but we call it goosing. And what that is when a firm, you'll take their spiking gas and they'll blast it through the system, right? And then as that cal gas comes down, they get their dilution factor right where they need it per the US EPA method, and it falls. And then they collect the good data, right? But it keeps falling. So the sampling system has an issue, but it makes it look like nothing's wrong because you capture the good data and not the whole picture. So in terms of checks and balances, kind of like I touched on briefly before, in FTIR world, we can go back and validate data, right? We can look at the spectra, compare it with known calibrations, and have a true understanding of what's in the gas matrices. And the reason we do this is obviously for accuracy and precision, but we also want to make sure that the data is real, right? We don't want to report something, especially if the limits are above what is permitted, right? We have to make sure, because as a stack tester, at the end of the day, we're always the ones that get the point, the finger. It's you're wrong, right? We're fine. It's not always the case, but we usually take the heat for it, and we have to make sure that we're collecting good data. So for validation, I won't go too deep into this. There's basically 3 buckets of why we do this, and this is in US EPA methodology. This is a requirement, but so few firms actually do this because of lack of understanding, new regulatory people. They just don't know what validation is. They're told that, hey, it's good, and they take the word for it. So what validation is doing is on the instrument side, it's making sure that we have the proper FTIR configuration for the job, right? That we've got good line shapes, everything's looking good on signal to noise ratio. It's the right tool for the job. But after we collect the data, it goes through a QA/Q process with reporting. We make sure that the data collected is real, it's viable. And also while we're on site with the QA/QC, as mentioned, we're using very stringent calibration gases and processes to make sure that the system is accurate. You don't want to go on site, run the FTIR, and then have a bunch of problems afterwards and try to explain yourself. You want to get it done right the first time. So a little bit of a backstory of why validation is so important. We had a firm that sent us some data that they needed validated, and they said, hey, look, we submitted this data. Well, we haven't submitted it yet, but what we're finding is that the methanol that we're quantifying is above their permitted limits, right? They're in trouble. Can you make sure that the data is right? So when we looked at it, at first glance, and that slide didn't pop up, but the methanol was above 5 ppm. That was their limit, 5 ppm. And they were seeing, 7 ppm or so. And in this region of where they were quantifying, there's all these kind of nasty things that they didn't have in their recipe. And this is the beauty of validation. We could go back, add, subtract things. And as we went through, we subtract water and all the big constituents, ammonia, CO2, right? And before we got to the methanol, which was not in their recipe, we noticed this big ugly peak right here, right? And they weren't quantifying that. And it turned out to be a big, long amine. And once we added the calibration to it, cleaned it up, it turns out that the methanol was actually at 3 ppm, 2.7 ppm. So had they not gone through the validation process, they would have reported over their compliance, and they would have been in, customer would have been in trouble at the end of the day. So that's why validation is so important, right? It's a checks and balances. It's something that's required that most firms aren't doing, but they should be doing. Yes, it's extra time. It adds a little bit of extra cost on the reporting. Once again, you get it right the first time, so you don't have to go back and test. So for the end game of FTIR, right, the whole premise is, do you stand by your data? And the FTIR is a viable tool for compliance and engineering purposes. But at the end of the day, what we're all kind of here to do, save some time and money on our testing. And that's why the FTIR is a great option for stack testing, because once again, real-time on-site analysis, right then and there what your concentrations are. But it's also a tool that can be used in way, way more than just stack testing. So that's it. Is there any questions? Yeah.
On
Yes.
Do you do any statistical tests that compares the sample set to the calibration data?
Yes, so there's lots. So generally, the calibrations hold, there's a 2% variance, and you can take the calibrations and move them between computers and instrumentation. So it's about 2% of a window for every calibration, if that answers your question.
Do you have any differences, when you sample, so, I mean, do you use, white cell primarily, or do you use, you know, full-length beams, or how, I mean, what is your percentage on, do you do fence line testing with the larger systems and?
Yeah, so there's a lot of configurations, right? So, you know, long path is generally fence line preferred. In stag testing world, we generally go with a fixed, it's 5.11 meters, path length cell. And there are certain, you know, vendors that we are accustomed to using. So one of the ones that we use quite frequently is MKS. They're pretty widely known. So that's largely what you find in stag testing world. And we're, you know, we kind of stick with what we know, right? But there's a lot of really good FTIR options out there. It just depends on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, there's lots of custom cells.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Blake.
Yep.
Thank you.